And the IEA has always been founded on the principles that, in essence, markets work and the state sector doesn't. But the state sector is plagued with inefficiencies and problems that the market sector is not plagued by. That doesn't mean that every free market always operates perfectly. It doesn't mean that markets always deliver the absolute ideal outcome or that all decisions made in the marketplace are always wholly rational. If they were, no business would ever go bust, right? But it does mean that the IEA has continually argued for and researched and propounded the case that in virtually all sectors of the economy, and indeed in human life, freedom and free markets are a better solution for peace, prosperity, growth, wealth, health and happiness than governments, politicians and bureaucrats being in charge of large sectors of the economy.
So where might the boundaries be, do you believe, now between markets and the state? I mean, we have governments and we have states. How far should they be involved in the economy? Where are those boundaries?
Well, it's a very interesting question. The IEA itself doesn't take a corporate view to work for or support the IEA. I mean, I think, in very rough terms, I think that in order to provide what I would consider to be the key functions of the state, which is upholding the rule of law, upholding property rights, the defence of the realm, and I'm rather with Friedrich Hayek, the founding guru of the IEA, that you need a welfare safety net of some sorts. I think a reasonable-ish sort of target would be that you'd expect the government sector to be somewhere around 20 or 25% of national income. I would have thought for a fifth or a quarter of national income, you should comfortably be able to provide those key functions, and that the free side of the economy would be somewhere around 75%, perhaps 80% of the economy. But I'm not doctrinaire about those exact numbers, and I'm more interested in the trajectory of travel. Perhaps were we in my wildest fantasies to get to a government sector that only accounted for a quarter of the economy, it might be that further efficiencies can be found, that we can reduce it further still. And my broad view would be that the more affluent society gets, the lower that percentage of government control could be or should be. I mean, in a society in which we are seeing, in general terms, notwithstanding some pretty difficult economic times since 2008, but in general terms, each generation is measurably richer than the last, you would expect the welfare safety net to generally diminish as a proportion of national income over time, not have to continue to go up. You would expect technological advancements to make it rather easier to provide what I consider to be the few government services that need to be provided. So if you were to force me to a number, somewhere around 20 or 25%, but I don't think that there is an actual answer to that question which is sort of accurate to 2 decimal points.
Just on that trajectory of travel, if we look at every advanced country, every OECD country since 1960, certainly up to 2007, before the financial crisis, the size of government has increased in every single country as a share of GDP. So that trajectory of travel is actually been for governments to get a bigger share of GDP. And that's as those countries have generally got richer, primarily because of 3 components: healthcare, education and pensions. Would you see that those 3 components need to be provided by the market rather than provided by not only the government, but a large chunk of government has been providing those services in the rich countries?
Yeah, yes, and I would hesitate on the rich country thing. I mean, actually, for all I consider the UK government's so-called radical fiscal retrenchment to be rather pitiful, they are actually cutting spending in real terms. This will be the first government in any of our lifetimes. There will be nobody alive today who has ever witnessed a British government cutting expenditure in real terms. So here in the UK, it is falling as a percentage of GDP. Depending on which measurements you believe, our present government will have inherited public spending of touching or thereabouts 50%, and it's probably now down to about 45, 46%. And they claim that there's another few years to go. So we are seeing a fall here. But what we're also seeing is, let's not get too fat and lazy in the rich developed world. The fastest growing economies in the world, not just now, but over recent history, have been those that have had a state sector along the broad lines that I have suggested would be my optimal, about 20 or 25%. Hong Kong, for example, in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, had national income per capita about along the lines of the African average. It is now about 50% richer per capita than the United Kingdom. That's a pretty spectacular level of growth and has been, I think, in large part due to the fact that Hong Kong has a small state. Singapore will be the same. It's harder, perhaps, and you might even accuse me of cheating if we look at developing countries, China, for sake of argument, because it's easier to start from a low base and catch up. But China's spectacular economic growth, 8-9% per annum, they have a government sector which in some ways intervenes horrifically. You can be taken out and shot for disagreeing with the government. But in terms of the overall aggregate of the economy, accounts for about 17% or so of GDP. I think the lesson is pretty clear and pretty universal. I'm not saying there would be an exact perfect correlation on a chart, but basically the further you go away from 20 or 25% of GDP as being the broad level of government spending, the lower your growth rates become. So we've got to split off two things. Who provides the service and how do you guarantee that everybody can access it? And I think too often those questions get muddled in economic and political debate in modern Britain.
Just going back to the issue about your number of the desired number for the size of the state, and you've given us some very good examples where the state is relatively small and economies are growing fast. How do the Nordic countries fit into that narrative? By most measures, they're very prosperous, GDP per person, and they have very large government and large tax revenues as a share of GDP. Yeah,
that's true, what you assert, but it's only part true. We at the IEA actually did a whole piece of research looking at Sweden in particular, if we were happy to say that that was a typical example of Scandinavian countries. The truth of the matter is that the trajectory in Sweden, and I understand in the rest of Scandinavia, has been monumentally in a free market privatising direction. I think it is true that today Sweden has a slightly greater state sector than the United Kingdom, but that's a rounding error. It has colossally reduced the size of its state since the 1990s, from the high 60% of being controlled by the state to now about the same as the United Kingdom, a smidgen above, but only a smidgen above. If you were to look at Sweden and the UK, the GDP controlled by the state is much of a muchness. It is within the margin of error. So given that the trajectory of travel in Scandinavia has been towards a much smaller state, they might not quite have come down below the UK yet, but that's been the direction of travel. And a whole range of privatisations, which are still considered in the UK to be obscenely right-wing, for sake of argument, allowing profit-making schools, not even considered palatable or acceptable by the former Radical Education Secretary Michael Gove, then I think the story you get is of a region, and in the case of Sweden specifically a country, that has done an awful amount to embrace many, many more market mechanisms and a much smaller state structure over the past 20 years. And you would expect growth and affluence to, in large part, follow the trajectory of travel rather than the spot price. But the actual spot price at the moment between the UK and Sweden, not markedly different.
Let's turn to the UK. I mean, you mentioned that the UK has austerity policies, but I think you referred to them as being pitiful in terms of perhaps their magnitude. What's your view of the government's attempt to reduce the size of the state and particularly reduce the size of the budget deficit?
Well, perhaps one should be grateful for small mercies. They do. The coalition government in Britain does seem to be alive to the point that public spending is too high, that the deficit needs to be eliminated, and that the overall public debt is a serious threat to our economic prosperity. But actually reducing government spending in real terms by around about 1% a year, I don't think counts as a serious austerity programme at all. I mean, I don't like the term austerity. It's not obvious. Whose austerity is it? It might be austerity for those who are losing government support, but there's basically a one-to-one ratio here. I mean, government spending is tax. You can delay that. You can spend more today and pass on the bill to taxpayers next year, the year after, or the next generation. of taxpayers, but one man's austerity is somebody else's tax cut. We've seen over the course of this Parliament, after what the staunch left of centre opponents of the coalition government would have described as savage cuts, desperate austerity, we are still going to witness this government adding about £600 billion to the overall national debt. That's in roundabout terms, £10,000 for every man, woman and child will be spent by the coalition over and beyond the tax receipts that it brings in. I mean, it's spending £10,000 over the course of a parliament for every man, woman and child above your tax revenues is austerity. I dread to think what largesses would look like. We still have government spending now being about 45-46% of GDP on a downwards curve, but not a steep downwards curve. It will probably be somewhere around 2020 before we actually manage to balance the books. And I think it's crucial for us to realise that when we do actually manage to run a budget under whatever colour of government we have at the time that balances the books, that is not job done. That should be the norm, that governments spend what their tax revenue is, there or thereabouts. And my fear is that we sort of think, once we've managed to get to 2018, 2019 or 2020, and finally the government isn't overspending, well, it's party time again. And the reason that can't be allowed to be the case is the overall scale of the national debt. And don't just look at the balance sheet debt, that's worrying enough, and edging towards around about 100% of GDP, just being our balance sheet debt. I think we also need to consider the liabilities that we've taken on. Some of those liabilities we could legislatively extract ourselves from, but we have made incredibly generous promises to public sector workers, for example, that we're going to honour very, very generous pensions to them. We've made very generous offers actually to anyone who will claim the state pension, triple locked the state pension. Every year it will go up by 2%, or inflation, or the average wage rise, whichever is the greatest, not whichever is the lowest. So we have stored up a lot of future liabilities that if Her Majesty's government was a company, would probably lead to its directors actually going to prison for fraud, because it's one thing to try and squeeze spending today by a small amount, but if you are actually enacting policies that cause considerably greater spending in 10 or 20 years' time, you've stored up a whole load of trouble. So if we want to actually get ourselves back onto what I would consider to be an even keel fiscally, we are going to have to find enormously greater savings, and we're probably going to have to spend a generation or more tackling these liabilities and making sure they are not permanent. If we look right the way back to, say, 1960, so I think this is a fair period, we're looking at more than half a century, and we're looking at, in the UK, at a whole range of different governments of a Conservative inclination and a Labour inclination, some with big majorities, some with small. Well, whatever the tax regime, the incentives or the rhetoric of those governments, no government has ever been able to bring in more than 38% of national income in tax. Now, if that is true, and I have no reason to disbelieve it, if somebody wants to come forward with some amazingly new tax system that could suddenly increase that, well, I'd be interested to hear the theory. But if that's true, then over the long run, government expenditure has to reflect that maximum income stream. So if we're typically only able to tax between 30 and 38% of GDP, we can only credibly spend, let's take the midpoint of that, 34% of GDP. And if you think we can only credibly spend 34% of GDP, then you actually need to cut present government spending by around about a quarter.